Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Nevada. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the late summer of 1891, deep in the desolate stretches of Lincoln County, Nevada, a traveling caravan halted at a dusty, roughly built stage station known as Coyote Spring. At dusk, when the sun dropped behind distant ridges, a figure emerged from the gloom. A stern woman in dark garments, her presence commanding the few travelers still unsettled by the day's heat. She approached one of the station's attendants, whispering words that would later be recorded in a local ledger. "Don't touch him, I'll buy him." The man in question, gaunt, sunburned, and clearly uneasy, was led forward, under her gaze, as though she were making a transaction no one dared question. The records do not name the woman that evening, but county dispatches call her Mrs. Clarabelle Rain, a name later whispered in local saloons and at sheriff's offices. The attendant, one Samuel Ortiz, later swore in a notarized affidavit that he saw her hand a small pouch of silver coins across the counter. A single witness, a stagecoach driver named George Lomax, claimed Mrs. Rain's eyes met his as she said the words, calm, measured, yet fatal in their certainty. That same night, the man she purchased vanished into the Night Range hills beyond the station. No alarms were raised before dawn. The man's name, if ever given, was never recorded in the immediate logbooks. Historians have compared some patterns in this case to the rise and fall of nearby mining hubs like Delamar, Nevada, another site of desperate fortunes and bitter ends. In Delamar's gold rush years of the mid-1890s, tens of transient laborers vanished without trace, leaving behind abandoned claims and rumors of foul play. The ambiance of suppression, secrecy, and unrecorded deaths became part of the lore in eastern Nevada. Delamar's story circles through local memory, even in whispers. And in the case of Mrs. Rain's night deal at Coyote Spring, some locals saw a familiar echo. But Coyote Spring was remote, a way station serving miners, cattle drovers, and itinerant settlers. The surrounding terrain was unforgiving. Jagged ridgelines, intermittent springs, scrub sage, and nights that swallowed sound. The stage station itself consisted of a lean building, a water trough, and a small bunkhouse. Communications with the county seat, Pioche, were delayed, and overland riders brought news after days of rugged travel. In those frontier years, a disappearance might go unnoticed until weeks later. So begins the tale of what would come to be called the Nevada Butcher Case, a string of vanishings, half-buried corpses, and a woman of cold, unflinching resolve. The first proper mention of Mrs. Clarabelle Rain appeared in the Lincoln County Herald, a slim two-page issue from October 1891. The notice described her as a woman of self-reliant manner traveling alone by wagon, claiming to trade in hides, tallow, and medicinal herbs. Her origins were uncertain. She had come from the direction of Delamar, where her name never appeared in any property or tax record. Yet several miners recalled a woman who bought meat by the crate, but was no rancher. In early November, Sheriff Elias Drummond received a telegram from Pioche stating that 2 laborers from the Coyote Spring way station had gone missing. Their last recorded presence was logged in the same book that mentioned Mrs. Rain's visit. Drummond's deputy, Hiram Keene, rode out with 2 men to investigate. What they found was unremarkable at first. The bunkhouse empty, a wagon rut disappearing into the foothills, and several half-charred bones near a dry creek bed. The bones, initially assumed to belong to livestock, bore faint knife scoring along the edges, something the deputy described later as cut clean, like from a table joint. In town, gossip spread. Some claimed Mrs. Rain lived alone on a homestead near the Muddy River. Others said she drifted between camps, offering meat stew and whiskey to lonely travelers. A letter preserved in the county archive, written by a Reverend Jonas Withers, described meeting a Mrs. R., who kept an orderly but airless household and spoke with an accent not of any western state. By winter, the locals began whispering her name with unease. "She comes to buy," Not to sell, a ranch hand told the Herald. The pattern was always the same. A solitary man, a brief acquaintance, then silence. Sheriff Drummond tried to collect testimonies, but by January 1892, most witnesses had left the area or denied involvement. The only written complaint came from George Lomax, the stage driver, who insisted he saw something dragged beneath a tarp in Mrs. Rain's wagon as she left the station. Drummond's notes describe Lomax as steady but frightened, as if realizing too late what he'd witnessed. The sheriff's final line in that file read simply, "Search impractical, territory vast, evidence insufficient." Yet the unease persisted. By spring, 2 prospectors near Delamar reported finding a makeshift smokehouse half buried against a slope, the smell so sour it turned them away. No formal inquiry followed. The Delamar mine at the time was consuming all local manpower, and men disappeared often enough to cause no alarm. Looking back through later investigations, historians noted how Mrs. Rain's movements traced loosely along the same freight routes feeding Delamar's boom. The connection was tenuous, but eerie. Both stories, Delamar's and hers, spoke of ambition hardened into something cruel. By the spring thaw of 1892, Claribel Rain had become a ghost in the record, mentioned in rumor, but absent from sight. Sheriff Drummond filed one last request for a warrant in Pioche, noting a wagon matching her description seen heading south toward Panaca. The requisition was denied. There were no formal charges, no identified victims, only fragments of stories stitched together by fear. Months later, a prospector named Albie Creel stumbled upon something peculiar near the dry gulch east of Coyote Spring. He'd been searching for copper seams and found instead a patch of disturbed soil. Beneath it lay what appeared to be remnants of a makeshift fire pit, scattered glass, and a broken cooking pot fused with bone fragments. Creel, uncertain what he'd uncovered, reported it casually at the Pioche Saloon, where the detail was noted in passing by a visiting reporter. It took another 3 months before anyone connected his find to the Rain incident. Dr. Merrill Parsons, a local physician sometimes deputized as coroner, was asked to examine the material. His report, preserved in brittle handwriting at the Lincoln County Courthouse, describes calcined fragments consistent with human ribs, perhaps 2 individuals, adult male, though degraded. He added a marginal note. No sign of animal gnawing, but consistent with burning in enclosed heat. The case might have ended there, were it not for the reappearance of a small, stamped metal tag recovered from the ash. It bore the inscription, C.S. Depot, Pioche. That tag linked back to a missing freight worker, Carl Simmons, last seen boarding a wagon driven by a tall woman in a black bonnet the previous year. Old-timers around Pioche later recalled a brief discussion of the case in the Delamar Nugget, the mining town's newspaper, where parallels were drawn between Mrs. Rain's quiet trade and the darker legends already forming around Delamar's early camps. The Nugget, in its typically terse tone, remarked that Nevada has always bred those who take and those who vanish. For months, fragments of testimony drifted into the sheriff's office. Sightings of her wagon near Crystal Springs, reports of a woman trading smoked meat at miners' shacks, or offering broth to stagehands on cold nights. No one could prove it was her, yet every description aligned. Thin, erect posture, gloves even in summer, and a single silver locket worn tight at her throat. In mid-1893, the county records include a strange entry. A constable from Panaca, one Thomas Greer, recorded a complaint from a family whose dog had unearthed a portion of a human femur near their root cellar. The constable delivered it to Dr. Parsons, who filed a brief note. Old bone, brittle, cut clean, not recent. Still, whispers grew. The miners began calling her the Nevada Butcher, though none could say why she was never caught. By late 1893, the rumors had taken on a life of their own. Every remote settlement in eastern Nevada seemed to have its own version of the story. A lone woman trading by moonlight, a wagon that left no tracks, a stew pot that never emptied. At first, Sheriff Drummond dismissed these tales as drunken embellishments, but then came a letter from a Reverend Harlan Voss of the small parish near Hico, who claimed to have received a confession from a dying freight driver. The man's name was Jed Wallace, and according to Voss's journal, he spoke of having delivered to the woman 3 souls, though what that meant was unclear. He said he was paid in silver dollars, and that the woman had told him, "Do not look at what you haul. Some things travel easier in silence." Wallace's body was found 2 days later, and with him a handbill advertising a food merchant in Delamar, one C. Rain Company Provisions. No such business ever appeared in county listings. When investigators compared handwriting between the handbill and the Pioche ledger entry signed by Clarabelle Rain, they found only a single letter in common, an ornate capital R. Still, it was enough for Sheriff Drummond to reopen his inquiry. He contacted the Delamar Mining Company, requesting any records of a supplier by that name. Their reply, preserved in the courthouse archives, stated plainly, "No known vendor or associate, perhaps a misprint." Meanwhile, the boom in Delamar was nearing its height. The town had gained a reputation for both wealth and tragedy. Miners called it the Widowmaker, due to the fine silica dust that destroyed men's lungs. Death was so commonplace that new graves appeared weekly along the ridges. Within such a grim setting, the idea of one more disappearance scarcely stirred alarm. Yet the name Mrs. Rain surfaced again that winter, this time in a shipping log from Caliente. A wagon registered to that name had collected 3 crates of salt pork, flour, and lye, enough to sustain a household for months. A traveling tinsmith named Peter Sloan later testified that he'd shared camp with a woman fitting her description. She cooked little, spoke less, he wrote, and carried a small pistol in her apron. He noted that her wagon had a false bottom, though he assumed it was for smuggling liquor. When Sloan read about the so-called Nevada butcher months later, he sent a nervous letter to the Pioche office describing the same wagon, the same woman. His statement closed with a line that still chills readers of the record. Her eyes never blinked at the firelight. It was like she'd practiced being still longer than most folks practiced being alive. From that point, the trail of Clarabelle Rain began to fade again, north into the desert, where maps ended and memory failed. Spring of 1894 brought one of the few surviving official searches tied to the Nevada butcher case. Deputy Hiram Keene, the same man who'd examined those charred remains years earlier, rode out with 3 volunteers toward the muddy river basin. They followed wagon tracks leading into a barren ravine bordered by crumbling limestone shelves. The sun had baked the soil to iron. In Keene's log, written in blunt, tidy script, he recorded, "The ground feels hollow here and smells of rot and iron." When they began to dig near a collapsed fire pit, they unearthed a rusted iron kettle, part of a scorched wooden crate, and a thin strip of cloth that had once been checkered. The smell drove them back. Keene described it later to the county clerk as an odor too deliberate to be the work of animals. Within a week, the local paper printed a single column, "Remains found south of Coyote Spring. Investigation pending." What followed was confusion and silence. The bones were never definitively identified. Dr. Parsons, again serving as coroner, suggested the remains could be animal, but noted the unusual presence of 3 belt buckles in the same layer of ash. One of them bore a maker's mark from San Bernardino, linking it to a merchant known to have supplied Delamar during its peak. Sheriff Drummond wrote privately to a colleague in Tonopah, speculating that Rain might have used the guise of a traveling supplier to conceal darker trades. In his letter, he admitted, "Her movements mirror the freight routes feeding Delamar's growth. Each time the town prospered, she appeared, then left, and death followed." The sheriff's notes grew more personal as the months passed. One margin reads, "I hear her name whispered like prayer, but no one swears they've seen her twice." By late summer, Keene returned to Pioche empty-handed. The only new evidence came from a prospector who sold him a locket found half buried near the ravine. Inside was a miniature tintype of a young boy and a faded inscription, E. Rain, age 9. There was no record of such a child anywhere in the territory. Historians studying the Delamar era, like those referencing Delamar, Nevada on modern archives, have pointed out how often the lives of ordinary settlers simply vanished into dust and superstition. A handful of graves, a ledger note, and a legend to carry the rest. Mrs. Rain's story blended easily into that silence. In autumn, the sheriff retired, his case files stored in an iron trunk beneath the courthouse stairs. One clerk's note in 1895 mentions him muttering about the woman who buys men, until his death a year later. After that, even the trunk itself went missing, most likely lost in the courthouse fire of 1901. Yet travelers through the region still spoke her name. Campfire stories told of a wagon wheel seen glinting at dusk, or a voice that offered, "I'll buy him," to anyone foolish enough to linger. By the turn of 1895, the territory had changed. The mines of Delamar still roared with the rhythm of drills and coughing lungs, and the railway had extended farther south. Yet among the freightmen and teamsters, the legend of the woman in black endured. Men spoke her name softly, as if invoking it might draw her near. A merchant named Edwin Blaine, who kept a general store near Caliente, later recalled an encounter from that spring. A woman, pale and composed, entered his shop to buy salt and kerosene. Her voice was low, her hands gloved despite the heat. She paid in older coinage, U.S. Mint, but stamped years out of circulation. When Blaine asked if she'd come from Delamar, she paused before replying, "I pass through where work is done, not where it's buried." Then she left. Weeks later, a wagon was found overturned 10 miles east of his store. It matched the description of hers, though no body was found. Only spilled kerosene, broken jars, and an apron singed at the hem. Locals assumed it had been scavengers or fire. Yet in the sheriff's notes from that period, there's an odd detail. Footprints leading away from the wreck, bare and deliberate, vanishing into the sage. In 1896, the new sheriff, Marion Clegg, briefly reopened the file. He was methodical, skeptical of folklore, and tried to link the story to known crimes. In an interview years later, he admitted that the old records unsettled him. Every witness wrote her name the same way, Rain with an E, but never an address, never a return. He believed she might have been a fugitive from another state, perhaps hiding under assumed identity. A single photograph emerged around this time. It was found in the belongings of a traveling photographer named Cyrus Bell, whose studio operated briefly in Pioche. The image showed a woman in somber dress, her face half-turned, eyes dark and severe. On the back, Bell had written, "Only customer, Mrs. R." The plate itself was damaged, marked with a faint chemical streak across the mouth, as though the image resisted being fully fixed. Sheriff Clegg sent the photograph to a contact in San Bernardino, asking if anyone recognized her. The reply was cryptic. A woman resembling this passed through Barstow in '89, selling bottled tonic. She called herself Mrs. C. Rains. Whether coincidence or clue, the report deepened the enigma. Some believed Mrs. Rain had escaped Nevada entirely, moving through border towns under new names. Others whispered that she never left, that she'd buried herself somewhere among the canyons in the same soil that hid her crimes. Even as Delamar's prosperity waned, the legend found permanence. Men at the saloon spoke of the butcher's wagon that appeared after a hard storm, or of finding coins pressed into the mud, old and tarnished, bearing dates too early to explain. History, it seemed, had chosen not to forget her, only to obscure her behind dust and rumor. By 1897, the boom towns of eastern Nevada were thinning out. Delamar, once roaring with over 3,000 souls, had begun to crumble beneath its own weight. The silica dust still hung in the air, pale as morning veils, coating windows and lungs alike. And in that slow decay, old fears resurfaced. People whispered of ghosts, not only of miners, but of her, the woman who bought men and vanished into the desert with them. That summer, an amateur geologist named Ephraim Lowell filed a curious report to the county office. He'd been mapping mineral veins east of Coyote Spring when he stumbled upon a shallow ravine filled with animal bones, and among them, human teeth. Lowell turned them in, expecting a miner's grave, but the coroner, Dr. Parsons, noted that the molars were unusually well kept. No signs of mining wear, his note read, perhaps belonging to travelers or clerks. Parsons, by then an old man, added a final line. Pattern resembles prior cases filed under Rain inquiry. But the trail had grown too faint. No new witness, no living suspect, just another box in the courthouse basement marked unresolved. Meanwhile, in a frontier settlement south of Caliente, an elderly homesteader named Nora Bellamy gave an interview to a traveling correspondent from the Reno Gazette. She claimed to have housed a woman named Mrs. Rain in 1892, polite, well-spoken, and always carrying a leather case she refused to open. She smelled of smoke and lye, Nora said, and paid extra to have her meals cooked out back. When asked what she remembered most, the widow answered without hesitation. Her eyes. She watched people like she was memorizing where to cut. The correspondent dismissed the account as rambling folklore, but the transcript survives. Years later, historians would cross-reference Nora's description with the daguerreotype recovered from Cyrus Bell's studio, noting, gee, the eerie consistency. Even as the century turned, the story lingered. Prospectors who camped near Coyote Springs swore of hearing the clatter of a wagon wheel at dusk. A miner's diary from 1900 mentions a woman's voice humming in the sage, and the next line simply reads, "Dogs won't go near the creek." By now, the tale had shed its human details. Mrs. Rain had become something else, a figure half-remembered, half-dreaded, invoked to keep travelers cautious. Mothers warned their sons not to follow strangers down from the road. Drifters spoke of a phantom wagon that stopped for no one, its lantern swinging dimly against the wind. The Delamar, Nevada reference appeared one last time in local papers that decade, not as a crime note, but as part of a ghost column. Among the ruins and silica dust, some still say the widow walks, counting silver coins by moonlight. There were no more official mentions after that. Only the land remained, holding its silence the way it had held every secret before. In the early months of 1898, a flood swept through the valley near Crystal Springs, washing loose the upper layer of earth that had long concealed old wagon paths and forgotten campsites. When the water receded, travelers passing through noticed a peculiar object jutting from the bank, a rusted cooking pot, half filled with compacted ash. The pot was taken to the small constable's office in Panasa, where it was cleaned and catalogued as item of interest, possible historical significance. Inside the ash were fragments of paper, fused together but still bearing faint traces of ink. The county clerk, William Nance, carefully separated them, revealing what appeared to be portions of a ledger. Only 4 legible words survived. Paid, Samuel Ortiz. 2. Ortiz, the same attendant who'd first witnessed Clarabelle Rain's transaction years before. Nance, familiar with the case, wrote in his margin, "If authentic, it closes a circle." The rediscovery sparked brief excitement among officials who once again combed through what little documentation survived. But the records were sparse, and the original affidavit signed by Ortiz had disappeared, possibly stolen during the courthouse fire of 1896. All that remained was his name, faintly preserved in the ash, and a handful of recollections from old-timers who barely remembered the scandal. At the same time, the last fragments of Delamar's life were fading. Its population dwindled to a few hundred, and wind carried more dust than sound through the canyon streets. In one of those derelict buildings, a miner named Levi Turlow found what might have been her mark, a small wall carving shaped like a single letter R, burned at the edges as if seared into the plaster. Turlow took a charcoal rubbing, later shown to a local historian, who noted that it matched the ornate R used on that old handbill marked C. Rain Company Provisions. Such coincidences were common, and yet they refused to fade. Turlow's letter was the last physical trace of her existence ever found. Dr. Parsons, now retired and nearly blind, was asked by a young journalist to recall the case. He declined at first, but eventually said quietly, "Some sicknesses walk in daylight, and we only call them evil because we don't understand their patience." When the journalist asked if he believed Mrs. Rain was real, he replied, "As real as Delamar and just as dead, but the ground remembers both." That interview never ran. It was found decades later among the journalist's drafts, the pages brittle and yellow, dated 1898. Even so, word of the rediscovered ledger spread. In saloons, it was said that the silver coins found in the mud were cursed, cold to the touch, no matter the heat. Superstition mixed easily with truth out there, and in the space where fact ended, Clarabelle Rain's legend only deepened, settling into Nevada's dust like everything else that refused to rot quietly. By 1899, Nevada was changing again. Rail lines pushed deeper into the territory, and with them came record keepers, clerks, and the new bureaucracy of statehood. Yet for all their ledgers and surveys, none could explain the recurring marks found near Coyote Spring that year. Thin trenches forming what appeared to be deliberate ovals in the soil, each precisely 6 feet long, cut too clean to be natural. The discovery was made by a surveyor named Jonas Ellery, who'd been marking the route for a proposed telegraph line. He reported it to local authorities, calling it a curious alignment of shallow graves, or so it looked in the light. When a deputy rode out to confirm the finding, he located only 3 of the indentations before a storm erased the rest. The deputy, Arthur Day, filed his report with a reluctant note. Too even to be graves, no scent, no trace, just an echo of intent. Locals muttered that the earth there had memory, that when rain fell, shapes returned of what once was buried. To many, it was proof that Mrs. Rain's victims were resurfacing, though none could say why. Meanwhile, the Delamar mining district was near collapse. The once thriving gold town now looked skeletal, its mills silent, its saloons boarded. Only the graveyard grew. It was around this time that a visiting physician from Utah, Dr. Charles W. Hutton, spent a few days cataloging unmarked burials for a regional report. He later remarked, "Half these men were never recorded as living, much less dead. Nevada eats her own stories." Among Hutton's sketches was a faint outline of a headstone fragment reading E. Rain, age 9. He thought little of it, assuming it was unrelated to the legend. But when compared years later to the inscription found in Sheriff Keene's locket, the name matched exactly. Historians would later speculate that the child may have been real, perhaps Mrs. Rain, his son, and that his death had twisted something inside her beyond recognition. The tragedy of Delamar and the legend of the butcher intertwined after that. Old miners claimed she'd come to feed her grief, not her hunger. Others whispered that her boy's grave was empty and she was still looking to fill it. In 1900, a traveling preacher from Tonopah recorded in his log that, while crossing the dry flats near Crystal Springs, he saw a woman in a long black coat walking against the wind. When he hailed her, she turned, and then was gone. He found no footprints in the sand. Even Dr. Hutton, in later correspondence, admitted to feeling a suffocating stillness when visiting those sites, as if the dust carried more than air. He ended one letter with a line still quoted in local histories. "The butcher of Nevada may never have lived, but the land behaves as though she did." And for those who traveled through those forgotten valleys, that was reason enough to look over their shoulders after dark. By the first months of 1901, the tale of the Nevada butcher had been reduced to folklore, printed in the back pages of penny journals. Most retellings were embellished beyond recognition, ghost stories for miners and stage drivers who needed an excuse for their fear of the dark. Yet, in Pioche, one small event reignited official interest. During renovations at the Lincoln County Courthouse, workmen uncovered a half-burned iron trunk wedged between the foundation stones. Inside were several heat-warped folders, the ink melted to brown ghosts of words. Among the fragments, the name Mrs. C. Rain appeared twice, alongside notations by Sheriff Drummond. One passage survived intact. Payment made in silver, serials filed under Caliente, witness list incomplete, Ortiz absent. Drummond had been dead 6 years by then, but his handwriting was unmistakable. The papers were delivered to the county archivist, who sealed them in oilskin to prevent further decay. Within a week, The courthouse caught fire, the same blaze that destroyed dozens of records. Some claimed it was faulty wiring. Others muttered that the land refused to keep her name written twice. Later inspection revealed that the trunk's metal had warped outward, as though heated from inside. No accelerant was found. The incident revived older citizens' memories. A man named Hiram Keene, Jr., son of the original deputy, told a traveling journalist that his father used to speak of a cellar out near the old creek, where bones never settled. Keene, Jr. claimed his father had seen something stacked like timber, cut neat and low to the ground, but that the sheriff forbade him from mentioning it again. That same year, an amateur historian from Salt Lake City, Margaret E. Ford, arrived to collect folklore for her upcoming book, Deserts of the Dead. She spent weeks interviewing ranchers, drifters, and miners around Coys, Oat Spring. Her notes, now preserved at the University of Nevada, describe a recurring phrase among locals: "She buys what's already lost." Ford tried to trace any genealogy for the Rain name, but found none in census records. However, she did locate one peculiar entry, a burial ledger from Delamar Cemetery, dated 1885, listing a boy named Elias Rain, age 9. The stone had since been broken and lost. She connected the date to the mining boom and proposed that Clarabelle Rain's descent into infamy might have begun after her child's death from dust pneumonia, a common killer in Delamar known to strike miners and children alike. The town's own medical history, later recorded on the Delamar, Nevada page, echoed the same scourge. Her theory was quiet, sympathetic even, that grief had calcified into madness. But not everyone agreed. When Ford published her findings in 1903, she received anonymous letters from Nevada postmarks that read simply, "You should not have written her name." She never returned to the state again. By 1904, the desert had reclaimed most of Delamar. The once famed Widowmaker stood in silence, its mills skeletal, its streets powdered in white dust. Only the cemetery endured, its crooked markers clinging to the hill like ribs from a giant carcass. And still, the locals spoke softly of Mrs. Clarabelle Rain, no longer as a woman, but as a presence. In a letter to the Carson City Daily Appeal, a telegraph operator named Lewis Carter described an unsettling night run between Caliente and Pioche. His crew had halted their handcar after hearing what he called the rhythmic jingle of harness chains. When they shone their lamps, there was no team, only a single set of wagon tracks ending abruptly in sand. Carter, practical by nature, thought it was an echo of a long-gone trail. Still, he noted the air smelled faintly of kerosene and boiled meat. Not long after, a young deputy named Raymond Sutter reopened the courthouse file, determined to close what he saw as an embarrassment to the county's record. He re-interviewed surviving witnesses, few remained, and tracked one peculiar clue. A Pioche boarding house ledger from 1891 listed Mrs. C. Rains, traveling for provisions. She had paid for 2 rooms. When asked why, the clerk said she told him, "One for rest, one for memory." Sutter rode out to Coyote Spring that winter with a small crew. In his journal, he described the place as unnervingly quiet, like time refused to start again. They camped near the dry creek, where bones had been found years before. On the second night, one of his men, Joseph Wilkes, swore he saw a woman standing beside the wagon, black dress, bonnet, motionless. When the men fired warning shots, she dissolved into the dark, leaving only the smell of smoke. The sheriff dismissed the story as superstition, but Sutter's field notes took a darker tone after that. The last page reads, "Found glass fragment. It's near the ash pit. Smelled lye. Something else, too. Like cooked leather." The page ends mid-sentence. The following spring, Sutter's horse was found wandering near Panaca. The deputy himself was never seen again. His disappearance was quietly filed as "lost in desert storm." A decade later, his notebook resurfaced in a trunk at his sister's home in Reno. The ink had faded, but one line remained clear beneath the soot. "If she walks still, she walks where the wind forgets to move." Historians who revisited the Delamar, Nevada archives in the 20th century occasionally stumbled upon these fragments, each confirming that the case was less a tale of crime than of something unfinished, a grief left to rot under open skies. And through all the retellings, one phrase endured across witnesses, from miners to drifters: "Don't touch him, I'll buy him." It was always said the same way, calm, precise, and entirely without mercy. The years after 1905 brought with them the slow burial of the old frontier. Rail replaced trail, mining towns emptied, and those who remained preferred to forget what they'd heard whispered around campfires. Yet Nevada's silence is deceptive. It keeps its ghosts just below the dust, waiting for a restless boot or a stray storm to uncover them again. That winter, a construction crew extending the telegraph route near Coyote Spring unearthed a shallow trench lined with stones. Inside, they found fragments of pottery and what one man swore were human knuckles, too fine for a miner's hand. The foreman, fearing delays, ordered the site resealed. He paid each worker an extra $1 not to mention it. The incident surfaced only years later when one of the men, Thomas Clay, gave a deathbed account to his son. Clay described the air turning colder, though the sun burned overhead, and how, for a moment, he thought he saw a woman standing beyond the ridge, watching. Around that same time, Reverend Harlan Voss, now an aging man himself, returned to the region. His earlier notes about Jed Wallace's confession had been cited in several pamphlets on Western folklore, but he claimed he wanted closure. Voss spent 2 days near the site where Coyote Spring once hosted the stage station. In his travel diary he wrote, "The well is gone, but something hums beneath the ground, like water or breath." He spoke later in Pioche about Delamar's decline, drawing a connection between the town's sickness, the silica dust that turned lungs to stone, and the story of Mrs. Rain. Perhaps the same poison that killed the miners killed her softer parts too, he suggested. She only kept what the desert kept, bones and silence. But the audience, mostly younger townsfolk, laughed him off. They'd heard newer tales, railroad hauntings, lost treasure, phantom prospectors. The old woman's legend had become outdated, a curiosity for scholars and eccentrics. Still, strange events continued to punctuate the quiet. A telegraph operator recorded phantom clicks on the line near Coyote Spring, transmitted in rhythm with passing storms. One sequence, translated by a code specialist, seemed to repeat the same 3 words: paid in full. No official record ties those signals to anything human. Yet, when the operator visited the site a week later, he found the pole wires severed cleanly, as if by heat, not blade. By 1906, most officials had given up chasing ghosts. The Butcher of Nevada, if she ever lived, was long gone. Yet for those who studied the ruins, every coincidence seemed to align too precisely, every gap in the record too neatly burned. It was as though the land itself had become the custodian of her secrets, guarding them not from justice, but from memory. And for a few who wandered through those canyons at dusk, they swore that when the wind changed, they heard it, the faint jingle of coins, and a woman's calm voice saying words no one should ever have spoken aloud. By 1907, Delamar's last newspaper had ceased printing, and the desert was reclaiming what had been built with fever and desperation. Yet every few years, another clue seemed to surface, like the land refused to fully bury the story. That summer, a letter arrived at the Pioche post office, addressed simply to the Sheriff of Lincoln County, Nevada. Inside was a single page, unsigned, in spidery handwriting. "You looked in the wrong wells. The rest are under the salt." The phrase puzzled the current sheriff, Albert Miles, who assumed it was a prank. But when he asked the postal clerk about the envelope, she noted something odd. The stamp had been canceled 12 years earlier. Miles dispatched 2 deputies to investigate the dry salt basins west of Crystal Springs. They found no graves, only shallow depressions where wagon wheels once carved through the crust. But among the cracked ground, one deputy found a corroded spoon engraved with the initials CR and a faint maker's mark from St. Louis. It was entered into evidence and promptly forgotten in the courthouse drawer, where it remained until the building's renovation in the 1930s. Still, that discovery reawakened the old dread in locals. For those who'd grown up with the legend, Mrs. Rain was not a ghost story. She was a curse attached to the land itself. Ranchers refused to graze near the basin, claiming their cattle grew nervous and broke fences at night. The following winter, a drifter named Benji Crane came through Panaca, half-starved and delirious. He told the constable he'd found the butcher's table in the desert, an iron slab half buried in the ground, scorched on one side. When asked to lead them there, he refused, saying, "It's gone when the sun's up, only comes back when it rains." Crane died of fever 2 days later. The constable's log mentions that before he passed he muttered, "She's still buying." Scholars who revisited these notes decades later noted how the story's details evolved, yet remained eerily consistent. A woman in black, silver coins, missing men, and burned remains near the springs. Each retelling adjusted the geography, but not the essence. It was as though every witness remembered the same dream differently. When cross-referenced with mining records, historians found that several men listed as disappeared in the Delamar district during the 1890s matched the time frames of Rain's alleged appearances. Their names, Simmons, Ortiz, Creel, formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Even more curious was an unsigned page in an 1894 freight manifest recovered from the Nevada archives, a simple list of supplies ending with one line in distinct, feminine handwriting. Salt, lie, 2 bodies. Archivists later concluded it was a clerical joke, but others weren't so sure. The handwriting, under magnification, matched that of the letter found in 1907. And so the story refused to rest. Like everything buried in that desert, it had a way of rising back up through the salt. In 1908, the Nevada Territory was modernizing faster than most could comprehend. Telegraphs hummed, new roads stretched across the flats, and the notion of the Wild West was dissolving into nostalgia. Yet some corners remained untamed, and it was in one of these lonely stretches, just north of Coyote Spring, that a group of railway workers made a discovery that brought Mrs. Rain's name whispering back into daylight. They were grading the land for a siding when one of the men, Louis Darnell, struck iron beneath the gravel. Digging around the object, they uncovered a half-buried cooking range, its frame warped with heat. Beneath it, encased in hardened soil, were 3 shallow pits lined with salt crystals and broken glass. Among the fragments, the foreman found a single rusted tag stamped Pioche Freight Cumbra, 1891. That evening, as the crew made camp, a sudden windstorm rolled through. One worker swore he saw a lantern swinging in the distance, steady, deliberate, until the dust swallowed it. When they returned the next morning, the range and the pits were gone, replaced by smooth earth as if never disturbed. The foreman filed a brief note about the incident, but refused to delay the project, writing only, "Ground uncooperative, unstable, proceeding east." Local newspapers ran small columns under headlines like, "Relic found from old crimes, an echo of the butcher returns." For a week, the towns buzzed with talk, then fell silent again. Still, some residents began to see patterns in the accidents that followed, equipment breaking inexplicably, 2 mules found dead without cause, and 1 man disappearing from his tent before dawn. Around that same time, a visiting ethnographer, Dr. Helen Carr, stopped in Lincoln County to record desert folklore for the Smithsonian's Field Survey. She collected multiple accounts of a woman who trades men for meat among Paiute elders, who spoke of her as both human and spirit. In their stories, she was not called Rain, but Sigai, meaning the buyer. The legend, they claimed, predated the mines by generations, but had taken on the white woman's face after the settlers arrived. Dr. Carr noted how the folklore mirrored the documented disappearances of the 1890s, including those near Delamar, Nevada, drawing a delicate line between belief and history. Her conclusion was cautious. What the desert holds is less important than what it remembers. When she published her notes the following year, many dismissed them as romantic anthropology. But to those who had lived through that uneasy time, Carr's phrasing struck close to home. Because even as Nevada's towns modernized, travelers continued to report strange encounters. A woman walking the salt flats alone at night, her clothing out of time, her footsteps silent. Most dismissed it as mirage or trick of light, yet one diary entry from a railway clerk remains unsettlingly specific. She asked the time, smiled, and said it didn't matter. Then the clock on the car froze at 11:17. It stayed that way until morning. The entry was dated October 17, 1908, precisely 17 years after the first record of Claribel Rain's name. By 1909, the legend of Claribel Rain had become a riddle, studied only by archivists, folklorists, and a few stubborn journalists who couldn't let the story die. Yet, deep in Nevada's mining archives, a new discovery gave the myth an unexpected pulse. A ledger unearthed from the collapsed DeLamar Assay Office contained a single, unfiled page dated August 1891, the same summer the first disappearance was recorded at Coyote Spring. It listed standard supply orders for salt, lye, and barrels. But in the margin, in a delicate feminine script, appeared 3 chilling words: settled in blood. The handwriting, once compared to the recovered freight manifest and to the surviving sheriff's notes, bore the same ornate loops, the same steady downward slant. Whoever wrote it was educated, deliberate, and unhurried. It could have been a forgery, of course, but archivists struggled to explain why someone would forge handwriting so obscure, attached to a case already half forgotten. Around that same year, a new mining company attempted to reopen the DeLamar site. In doing so, they accidentally exposed a series of small sealed chambers beneath what had once been the milling floor. Within, they found 3 tin canisters, each wrapped in oilcloth. When opened, they revealed small personal items: a pair of spectacles, a rosary, and a man's pocketknife. All 3 were scorched, as though once near intense heat. None of the company men could trace the belongings to known workers. The find reached local newspapers under the headline, "The Butcher's Relics," but public interest was fleeting. Nevada had moved on. Newer tragedies filled its pages. Yet among those who had studied the Rain case, there was something familiar about the discovery. One researcher, Dr. Arthur Pell, noted that the initials carved faintly into the pocketknife's handle were S.O., matching Samuel Ortiz, the man-furrer, as mentioned in the Coyote Spring ledger. The sheriff's office, already weary of folklore, declined to reopen the case. The artifacts were boxed, tagged, and misplaced within a year. Meanwhile, the few who still spoke of Claribel Rain did so cautiously. Among ranchers, she had become a parable about greed and grief. Among miners, a warning to those who lingered too long underground. And among the Paiute elders, she was no longer a name, but a shadow. The buyer, who came for those who traded their soul for silver. Visitors to DeLamar in those years wrote of the same unnerving quiet. No birds, no wind, only the distant echo of shifting gravel. One traveler recorded seeing a faint impression of a woman's footprint in the hardened dust. When he returned an hour later, it was gone, yet beside it lay a single untarnished coin. No date, no mint mark, just a faint etching of the letter R. By the spring of 1910, the mines had gone silent for good. DeLamar was little more than a hollow of wind and bleached timber, its shafts sealed with rusted iron gates. Yet silence, as Nevada has taught again and again, is rarely peace. That year, a team of geology students from the University of Nevada visited the area to study residual mineral deposits. Their notes describe a haunting stillness and a strange chemical odor near the old processing floor. One student, Eleanor Marsh, wrote in her field diary, "There is a weight to the air here, as if we are walking through someone else's breath." The students camped for 3 nights. On the second, Eleanor woke the others after hearing what she thought was metal scraping against stone. When they investigated, they found the ground around their camp disturbed, a shallow furrow curving in a half-circle, like something heavy had been dragged nearby. There were no footprints, animal or human. When the group returned to Reno, they filed their notes with the department, including a brief mention of the DeLamar, Nevada legend. Their supervisor dismissed it as hysteria, a ghost tale resurrected by tired minds and poor rations. But Eleanor, years later, swore under oath that what she'd heard was rhythmic. the steady creak of a wagon wheel turning slowly in dry earth. That same summer, a flash flood struck the muddy river basin, tearing away much of what remained of the old Coyote Spring Road. When the waters receded, locals reported bones protruding from the embankment. A small team of deputies investigated but found that by the time they arrived, the remains had already vanished, carried off perhaps, or reburied by the river's silt. All that survived was a single brass button engraved with the initials C.R. By autumn, no one wanted to talk about Clarabelle Rain anymore. The state was modernizing. Telephones paved, roads, electricity in Pioche, and the old superstitions were bad for tourism. Still, the new sheriff kept one framed photograph behind his desk. A daguerreotype of a woman in dark attire, face turned slightly aside, eyes unyielding. Beneath it, in fading pen, someone had written, Pioche, 1891. Mrs. C. Rain, unconfirmed. The sheriff claimed it reminded him to respect the unsolved. As for the land itself, travelers through those valleys continued to describe a sense of unease, the kind that settles in your chest and doesn't fade with distance. One rancher told a visiting journalist that after rainstorms, he often found circular impressions in the sand near his property, as if made by a wagon wheel, though none had passed that way in decades. And sometimes, when the wind rose at dusk, his horses would rear and pull away from their posts, ears pricked toward the basin, trembling. "They hear something," he said, "that we've learned to ignore." By 1911, the name Clarabelle Rain had faded from formal record, but not from the soil that had shaped her legend. Nevada's boomtowns were ghosts themselves now, their streets stripped by wind and their ledgers eaten by mold. Yet the butcher's story persisted in fragments, letters, notes, and one final entry buried deep within a university archive. That autumn, historian Margaret E. Ford, the same woman who had once written Deserts of the Dead, returned to the state for what she called a reconciliation with the ghosts I misinterpreted. She brought with her a phonograph recorder, hoping to document oral histories from surviving pioneers. One of her interviews, preserved in crackling wax, captures an old rancher named Jacob Heron, who claimed to have known the truth. "You all been looking for her grave," Heron said, voice brittle with age. "But she ain't buried. She's salted, buried men to cure the meat." Ford tried to press for details, but the man went silent, staring past her. The recording ends with the faint jingle of coins before the cylinder clicks out. Weeks later, Ford disappeared along the road between Caliente and Crystal Springs. Her carriage was found overturned, her equipment scattered but intact. The phonograph was recovered, its cylinder unbroken. Her driver swore he saw a figure in dark cloth crossing the flats moments before the accident. Ford's body was never found. The event reignited interest in the Nevada butcher, this time beyond folklore journals. Regional papers published serialized retrospectives, revisiting the Rain file with newfound curiosity. Scholars debated whether Ford's death was mere coincidence, a desert tragedy, or something older reaching up from the dust. The Delamar, Nevada ghost town, drew visitors again, this time carrying notebooks instead of pickaxes. Some came for history, others for proof. One journalist described the Ripa Ewins as a graveyard still breathing. He noted how the mine seemed to exhale heat even on cold days, and how each echo underfoot carried the faint ring of metal, as though someone far below still worked the earth. In the years that followed, locals began reporting a new phenomenon, silver coins appearing on windowsills after heavy storms, their surfaces blackened and warm to the touch. The sheriff collected several, sending them to Carson City for assay. Each proved genuine, minted before 1880, yet none matched any known circulation pattern. When asked what he thought it meant, the sheriff gave a dry smile. "Means she's still paying her debts," he said. Margaret Ford's final notebook, recovered months later from the wreckage of her wagon, ended on one unfinished line written in pencil. "The silence here is not absence, it is waiting." The page beneath it was blank, except for a faint thumbprint in ash. By the winter of 1912, the last breath of the story seemed to fade. The mines closed, the stage lines stopped running, and Coyote Spring was erased from new maps. Only the old-timers remembered where the road had once cut through the basin, where wagon tracks disappeared into white dust. The younger ones called it superstition, yet still avoided camping there. That December, a surveyor named Jonah Pike was sent by the county to chart the dry riverbeds after a series of flash floods. In his journal, still preserved in the Lincoln County archives, he noted how the compass needles spun erratically whenever he approached the area once known as the Coyote Route. The sand, he wrote, glimmered faintly at dusk, as if brushed with metal filings. He also mentioned finding a fragment of wood, scorched black, with the faint engraving of an R still visible beneath the soot. Pike completed his work, returned to Caliente, and spoke little of what he'd seen. But at the bottom of his field ledger, he added one final note. The ground hums when the sun goes down, as if someone is turning a wheel beneath it. After that entry, nothing more was written. The region never recovered its population. By 1915, Delamar stood fully abandoned. The wind pressed through broken glass and rusted mills, singing a low note that some said sounded like whispering. A few curious travelers claimed to see flickering light near the collapsed smelter, and once, a thin figure moving against the ridgeline, her outline vanishing the moment anyone tried to approach. Over the decades that followed, the legend of Clarabelle Rain endured only in fragments, half in county records, half in folklore. Some said she had been a grieving mother. Others, a criminal who turned the desolation of Nevada into her accomplice. The most enduring belief was simpler, that she had never left, that she still walked the dust between Delamar and Coyote Spring, buying silence where words once lived. When modern researchers revisited the Delamar, Nevada archives a century later, they found every reference to rain missing. Not erased, missing. Pages torn out cleanly, names blacked away with deliberate care. Yet among the documents that remained, one faint notation survived in the corner of a water-damaged ledger. Mrs. Rain, settled accounts. Do not reopen. Today, hikers who wander the empty ridges sometimes report the same strange sounds that haunted the early prospectors. A rhythmic creak like a wagon moving without horses, or the faint jingle of coins stirring in unseen hands. And in rare moments, just before the desert wind shifts, a few swear they hear a woman's voice, calm and steady, whispering from nowhere and everywhere at once. Don't touch him. I'll buy him. The sound carries for miles, echoing across a valley that remembers everything and forgives nothing. And then it fades, leaving only the hum of the Nevada dust, waiting for the next traveler who lingers too long after dark.